Alright, so where we left off was describing these two countries. And just before I move on, I wanted to talk a little bit about the reflected light side, and the shadow side rather. Okay, so we have the light coming at one direction, and it bounces off this wall, and it goes towards the shadow. Now, when we had the light hitting the light side, you saw that the planes perpendicular to the light would light up the most, right? Perpendicular lights up the most. So how do we know what planes on the shadow will light up the most? Well, the way you do it, depending on this surface, but let's say this surface was smooth, and I'll explain about surfaces later on, why that's important. But let's say this was a smooth surface, then the light comes down and it hits it, and then you have an angle here. And this is called the incident angle. And the angle at which the light bounces off is going to be the same on either side. So you have an angle formed where it hits and it also bounces off. So that's going to be the angle that if there's a surface parallel to that, that's the one that will receive the most light. So in this case, the incident angle, it's coming down like that. So we would want an angle close to that. So which one of these is the closest to that? Well, it's probably this one. So this will catch more light. Actually, no. This is closer to this. So this one will probably catch the most reflected light than these two. So it'll be a bit lighter even though it's still in the shadow. Now, let's take that, the thing we just did, and expand it to a little bit of a different surface, where I'm just breaking it down further now. Alright, so now we have more planes. And again, don't worry about thinking about this in 3D just yet. We're just going to view this as a two-dimensional surface, and it's just to understand the concepts because these are very important to get down. Okay, so now, and this is something you can do as well, pick where your light's coming from, what direction. So let's say it's coming from just purely on the side because it's easy. It's easy. So let's do that. It's coming from this direction at this angle, just straight on. And for the sake of making it easy, we're going to have an object. Let's say there's a wall and it's just on that side. Okay, so remember our two countries now, right? We have the light side and the shadow side. The light side is made up of highlight and midtone. The shadow side is made up of core shadow and reflected light. So let's figure out what is what. So I'm going to put down white is going to be for the highlight. I'll use a bit of gray for the midtone. And then a darker, much darker for the core shadow. So that's the area that's not really getting hit by reflected light. And then a bit lighter for the reflected light. So real quick, what you'll see is that there's a big difference between the midtone, which is the dark part of the light side, and the reflected light, which is the light part of the dark side, right? There's difference. And generally, a rule to have appealing values is to ensure that no part of the light side is as dark as the lightest part of the shadow. Does that make sense? It means your midtone is never going to be as light as your reflected light. and your reflected light is never your midtone's never going to be as dark as the reflected light, and the reflected light is never going to be as light as the midtone. So that keeps these in their own family. All right, so what's going to be the highlight? Well, obviously the thing perpendicular, so this is going to be the highlight. What else is going to get hit by light? This is going to get hit by light. This is going to get hit by light. This is going to get hit, still getting hit, right? Still gets hit, still gets hit, still gets hit. Gets hit by less light, but it still gets hit. But there's a point where the light's just going to go all the way past, and then it's going to bounce, and it's going to move on, right? So it's going to go all this way and then bounce off this wall. So just to keep it in two tones, we're going to have the highlight as this, and then these two planes would be midtone. And now all this is going to be shadow. So what we can do is start by just labeling all of it, coloring all of it in a shadow. But then some parts are going to get hit by reflected light, so what parts are going to get hit? Well, probably all these, you know, that are getting the bounce light from the wall are going to get hit by reflected light. Some of the light's going to pass through, and if this was three-dimensional, then there'd be light coming around and then bouncing back. So this too would probably be reflected light. But what you'll notice is that there's sort of a pattern here. And it goes like this. You get midtone. See, we have our midtone. Get midtone, and then you get highlight, and then you get, again, midtone, and then you get core shadow, and then you get reflected light. And this gives you what it looks like when you have something that is turning. Like, let's say we had that type of form, right? It's a very common pattern, and it's almost always there. So what you would see if you did have something like, let me just do it on a new layer. If you did have something like this shape, right? And you have light coming from one direction, then you'll get the highlight, which would be the plane perpendicular. Then you'd have the midtones. Then it gets into core shadow. And then usually there's something opposite that's allowing some bounce light to get into the reflected light, or to become reflected light. So now if I blend these, so I'm just blending where the transitions are, then you get this type of pattern that happens. And again, it's very common. You see this all the time. So I'm just going to extrude this as if we had a cylinder, maybe like a pipe. Just taking the values that we had, just putting them down. And you've probably seen shapes like this in life, and you get this pattern, right? So once you blend it, it sort of looks more I don't know, realistic. It's almost like a piece of foil, right? But here's the thing. You can tell this is curved because I have that curve to it, right? But even if I don't, even if I get rid of all this to show that it's a curved surface, and I just put like a flat thing here, it still looks curved. And the reason is that our brains know when it sees this pattern, that it means, oh, that surface is turning. So now this looks three-dimensional because we see, right, there's midtone, highlight, midtone, core shadow, reflected light. I know that. That's a curved surface. Right? So this is very important to get down. These two things, the light side and then the shadow side. And the core shadow, again, it's usually darkest closest to the midtone. So that area that separates the two, just to go over it again, is the terminator. Terminator. Okay, so now let's go back to this guy. Well, what you can see is that it's sort of, if I just keep adding planes in between this, it's starting to resemble a sphere, right? And usually things that talk about lighting, for instance, books or videos, they tend to start with a sphere and maybe a cylinder, sometimes a cone, and maybe a cube. And they show lighting on these surfaces. The reason I went through this whole thing about planes is because I feel if you don't understand planes, you don't know, well, what part of this gets, you know, the highlight, what part is the midtone, what part is the shadow, how do you know? But for instance, if we saw this shape now, the cylinder, if we break it down into planes, it's almost like a low polygon model in a video game. If you break it down like that, then it becomes easier to see what each thing would be, you know. If the light is coming from just the side, purely coming from the side, we would know this is going to be lit the most. So that's going to be light. And because it's not perpendicular, it wouldn't be that bright, probably more like that. In the middle, the light would pass it, so you would get your core shadow there. And that's a bit dark. Show you a trick. If I want to know what the core shadow would be, and I know the light side, if I open this up in Photoshop, so let's say this is the light, even though that would be the highlight. Let's just say this is the light for the midtone, and the shadow is black, right? Or not black, but black is here. Then to find the shadow, I just go halfway between this, and that gives me a good shadow. And it works for outdoors, but it's sort of a trick. It's like, okay, so that's our shadow, and then usually what I do personally is I always block in the shadow side and the reflected light together, and then I just paint in the reflected light a bit lighter than what I had for the shadow. So you see, if I think of it this way, it's like, okay, I can plot it out, and then all I have to do is sort of blend these edges and smooth out the top and the bottom so that you have that cylinder shape, right? Instead of a blocky shape. And the top's probably going to be in shadow too. And that makes it easier to understand how the light is going to affect things. And if you recall, the other thing I mentioned was that on the edge of things, on the corners of things, you get highlights often. So in the case of this object, probably right on this edge would be where the light is the strongest, and possibly you would get a little bit of light, just a little bit on that rim. So there. So that's how we have our cylinder. So from here, if you understand planes, then you can start to focus on these other shapes, and that's what we're going to do. In the next lesson, we're going to move on to drawing spheres and understanding how light works on a sphere.